Anxiety is mounting over whether or not US politicians will be able to put their considerable differences aside and agree on a deal to raise the debt ceiling. This would allow the government to begin borrowing again, rather than using its checking account at the Federal Reserve to pay for the day-to-day running of the country. And the clock is ticking louder and louder because Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that checking account will run out of money by the 1st of June, which is now a little over a fortnight away. There's no shortage of dire warnings out there about what would happen if this debt ceiling deal isn't agreed in time. TLDR, we're talking financial carnage on a 2008 scale.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
Yellen has been at pains to point this out, and she's correct. It's not a scenario anyone in their right minds wants to see play out. However, she's wrong about one thing, and that relates to the US government defaulting on its debts if a deal isn't agreed. Now, the last time the debt ceiling needed raising was back in 2021. It's been raised 74 times since 1962. And as the deadline approached, Yellen penned a warning in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, in which she said, quote, "The US has always paid its bills on time, but the overwhelming consensus among economists and Treasury officials of both parties is that failing to raise the debt limit would produce widespread economic catastrophe." Now, she's right on that second bit about economic catastrophe, but that first claim is a little shakier. Yes, US government debt, in the form of Treasury bonds, is generally considered to be the safest kind of debt to hold, but the US has in fact defaulted on its debt obligations in the past. And not just once, but 4 times. Now, this was pointed out to me by fellow YouTuber and all-round fount of knowledge Ben Cowan during a recent livestream we did. Now, I was intrigued because this line of how the US government has never reneged on its debt obligations has been trotted out a lot recently. So I decided to find out what instances Ben was talking about. And for your delectation, here they are. Now, the first default came way back in 1862 amid the carnage of the US Civil War. Like all wars, this particular dust-up was costing a heck of a lot of money. The government in Washington had issued so-called demand notes which promised to pay the bearer a stated amount. Classic paper money, in other words. These became known as Greenbacks because, well, the backs of them were printed in green ink. These were supposed to be redeemable for gold, but at times when the war wasn't going so well for the Union, banks became unwilling to exchange them for their supposed full value. That is a technical default right there. Okay, sure, mitigating circumstances, civil war and all that, but still. Now, Uncle Sam was as good as his word for the next 70-odd years until 1933 and the brouhaha over gold bonds. Up until that point, if you held US gold bonds, you could redeem them for gold coins whenever you wished. But good old FDR wasn't a fan of US citizens holding gold because it was tying up much-needed liquidity that he wanted to use to stimulate the economy, then in the midst of the Great Depression. So, with Executive Order 6102, he made holding gold illegal, and holders of either the physical stuff or the aforementioned bonds were obliged to turn their stashes over to the Fed in return for paper money, $20.67 an ounce to be exact. As you can imagine, many Americans were none too happy about this, and it ended up in front of the Supreme Court, which eventually ruled in the government's favour. The consensus now is that this was indeed a default, but most probably a very necessary one. Still counts though. Then, a mere 35 years later, in 1968, the government was up to its tricks once again, this time with silver. It had issued a whole bunch of silver certificates, upon which were written a promise to pay the bearer $1 silver upon demand. Problem was, there was quite a lot of demand for these silver dollars, mostly from investors and collectors. The coins were expensive to produce, and there was a shortage of the actual metal itself. Some in government were also worried that the silver certificates and the coins themselves might encourage hoarding and speculation. Even before the dawn of the fiat money age, it seems governments still hated the idea of their citizens saving rather than spending. So, the US government simply refused to honour the promise made on these silver certificates. The House of Representatives passed a bill to end the issuance of the certificates in 1963, and the redemption period ended in 1968. Another technical default right there. Sorry to interrupt you folks, but I have to let you know about the Coin Bureau deals page. Now, my team and I have been able to pull together some of the best promos and discounts in the whole crypto space. We're talking trading fee discounts of over 50%, thousands of dollars in bonuses, amazing deals at top exchanges, reduced prices on hardware wallets, and much, much more besides. So just go to coinbureau.com/deals, also linked to below, and find the promo best suited to you. And now, back to the video. Now, if these first 3 defaults by Uncle Sam are unfamiliar, I don't really blame you. Apart from FDR's executive order over gold, they're generally little more than footnotes in history. But this last default was a genuinely seismic event, the consequences of which we still live with today. In 1971, faced with runaway inflation, a trade deficit, and the ruinous cost of the Vietnam War, President Richard Nixon took a fateful step and announced the end of the gold standard. In 1944, as World War II was beginning to draw to a close, an agreement had been signed at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire that all national currencies would be redeemable for US dollars, which in turn would be redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. The US had the largest gold reserves in the world, thanks in large part to its efforts in supplying its allies with material to fight the war. Now, Nixon had this to say.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
And note the use of the word temporarily. Like a lot of things Nixon said, that wasn't true. This moment, now remembered as the Nixon Shock, marked the beginning of the era of fiat money, money not backed by any reserve asset printed at the whim of the government. Once again, the United States had found it expedient not to honour its debt obligations. And well, who wants to stand up to Uncle Sam and tell him he can't do what he likes?
I'm going to bomb the shit out of him. It's true. I don't care.
Nope, me neither. So, Janet Yellen is mistaken when she says the US government always honours its obligations. However, the likelihood of it defaulting this time around is small, but that doesn't mean we can all relax and breathe easy. As the days without a debt ceiling deal tick by and Yellen's June deadline approaches, markets are going to get more and more jittery. Yes, Congress always votes to raise the debt ceiling eventually and begin adding yet more to the $31 trillion plus of debt that the US has outstanding. Even though the polarization of American politics becomes more pronounced with every passing day, it's unlikely that those warring politicians on Capitol Hill will allow the US, and by extension the world economy, to go into meltdown over something which has become almost routine in the last few decades. But that's not to say this whole episode can't cause immense damage, even with a deal agreed. Back in 2011, an agreement went right to the wire before the government was able to begin issuing bonds again. But stocks still tanked by 17% in the aftermath, while the US's credit rating was downgraded for the first time in history. So, the next fortnight is going to be critical as the edge of the precipice gets ever nearer and the markets begin to get frightened. Will Uncle Sam pull his finger out? Or will he default for a 5th time?